The Wyoming wind howled across the boundless prairie, late spring of 1879, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and the faint tease of rain that never fell. Dust swirled in the air, clinging to every dream, every hope, and one question hung. Heavy over the rugged hills, what kind of woman drives a broken wagon through a lawless land, bound by a promise she never meant to make? Her name was Clara Hensley, though the trails she'd crossed hadn't cared to ask it. She gripped the reins of a creaking wagon, her hands chapped and raw, blistered from days of holding tight against the wind's pull. Her calico dress once, a soft blue, now faded to a weary gray, was streaked with red dirt and faint smudges of blood, none of it hers. In the wagon bed behind her, two children, Eli and Sam, huddled beneath a patched wool blanket, their small bodies pressed close. For warmth, their breaths shallow in the morning chill. Orphans, left by a mother who'd succumbed to fever 5 days ago in a desolate gully near Lander, her final words a desperate plea whispered through cracked lips. Don't let them be alone. Clara hadn't. She'd buried the woman under a loan. Cottonwood, piling stones to mark the grave, her hands trembling from exhaustion but resolute. Then she'd lifted Eli, 7, and Sam, barely 5, into the wagon, their tear-streaked faces silent, their eyes too old for their years, and driven west, her heart heavy with a vow she wasn't sure she could keep, the horse a weary chestnut. Murray, named Sage, stumbled on the rocky trail, her hooves worn thin from endless miles, her breath labored, a faint limp in her gait. Clara's supplies were long gone, the flour sack empty, the canteen dry, the last crust of bread shared with the children at dawn. Ellie's quiet cough echoed in the wagon. Sam's hollow eyes stared at the horizon, their small faces pale. Beneath the grime of the trail, Clara's jaw tightened, her throat burning with a mix of worry and guilt. She was running out of time, and the vast Wyoming plain offered no shelter, no mercy. The wind tugged at her shawl, a faded brown scrap. That barely kept the chill at bay, and she pulled it closer, her fingers stiff from cold and fatigue. Her own hunger gnawed at her, but it was the children's silence that cut deeper. Their trust in her a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Then, as the morning sun broke through a veil of gray clouds, casting golden rays across the jagged hills, she saw him a lone rider on a dappled gray horse, cutting across the ridge like he was carved from the land itself. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, a rifle slung across his back, he moved with a quiet purpose that made Clara's breath catch. His horse stepped sure-footed, its mane catching the light, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. The wind holding its breath as if it knew something she did and single quotes D. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun's glare. The rider slowed, approaching with measured steps, his hat tipped low, shadowing his face. He stopped 10 feet away, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, his eyes steady, unreadable beneath the brim-taking in her windburned face, the torn sleeve of her dress, the children peeking from the wagon bed, their small hands clasped tight beneath the blanket. You're a long way from anywhere, he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by years of wind, carrying a calm that felt both foreign and grounding. Need help? Clara's fingers tightened on the reins, her heart pounding. With a mix of wariness and desperation, she'd learned to trust no one on these trails where kindness often hid a price, where strangers could turn as cruel as the land itself. But Ellie's cough grew sharper, Sam's eyes flickered with hunger, and the weight of her promise to their mother pushed her to speak. I do, she admitted, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. We're out of food. The horse is failing. I don't know how much farther we can go. He dismounted, his boots crunching softly in the red dirt, and stepped closer, his hat still low, but his gaze now clear, direct, not unkind, with a depth that suggested he'd seen his share of hardship. Name's Eli Warren, he said, his words measured. Got a ranch 10 miles west, near Clearwater Creek, food, water, a place for you and the kids to rest? His eyes lingered on Eli and Sam, their blankets slipping to reveal their thin frames, their faces etched with quiet fear. Clara searched his face for a lie, a hint of danger, but found only a quiet resolve. like a man who carried his own burdens and knew the weight of hers. "Why help us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her hand still gripping the reins as if ready to bolt. Eli paused, his hand resting on his horse's flank, his gaze steady. "Because some promises are worth keeping," he said, his words heavy with a meaning she couldn't yet grasp, his voice soft but certain, like a vow made to the land itself. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes flickering to the children, then back to Eli, her heart caught between doubt and a fragile spark of hope. Could this stranger's offer be the refuge she'd been praying for, or a step into a darkness she couldn't outrun? The Wyoming sun blazed high over the boundless prairie. Late spring of 1879, its relentless light scorching the sagebrush and red dirt, where every trail bore the weight of dreams lost or longed for. Dust hung in the air, and one question simmered, like a spark in the dry grass. What does it take for a woman, broken by betrayal, to trust a stranger's kindness when her heart has learned to expect only pain? Clara Hensley gripped the reins of her groaning wagon. Her hands blistered and raw, the skin cracked from days of fighting the wind's pull. Her calico dress, once a soft blue, now faded to a weary gray, was streaked with red dust and faint. Traces of blood, not her own, clinging like memories she couldn't shake. In the wagon bed behind her, Ellie and Sam, the orphan children she'd vowed to protect, huddled beneath a patched wool blanket, their small bodies pressed close against the jostling trail. Ellie, 7, coughed softly, her face pale beneath the grime, while Sam, barely 5, stared at the horizon with eyes too hollow for his years, as if waiting for it to claim them. Sage, the chestnut mare pulling the wagon, limped more with each step, her breaths labored, her strength fading under the endless miles. Clara's throat burned with thirst, her heart heavy with a promise made 5 days ago to a dying mother. Near Lander, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Ahead, Eli Warren, the lone cowboy who'd offered them refuge, rode steady on his dappled gray horse, his broad shoulders a dark silhouette against the golden hills, his rifle glinting in the sunlight. Clara followed him through rocky passes and winding trails, the wagon's wheels creaking, dust rising in clouds that stung her eyes and coated her lips. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the faint jingle of Eli's spurs and Sage's weary hoofbeats. Clara's mind churned with doubt. She'd learned to trust no one in this lawless land where kindness often hid a price, but the children's hunger and Sage's faltering steps left her no choice. Ellie's cough grew sharper, Sam's small hand clutched the blanket tighter, and Clara pulled her frayed brown shawl closer, its edges catching the wind, whispering her fears back to her dot as the sun dipped toward the hills, painting the sky. In warm hues of amber and rose, Eli raised a hand, pointing to a valley nestled between rugged ridges. A ranch came into view, a sturdy log house with a tin chimney curling thin smoke, a weathered barn flanked by cottonwoods, their leaves rustling in the breeze, a creek glinting like a silver vein through the land. Clara's chest tightened, a flicker of relief battling her wariness. Eli dismounted, tying his horse to a post by the barn, his hat low, his eyes steady but guarded beneath the brim. "This is home," he said, his voice low and calm like a river smoothing stone. "You and the kids are welcome as long as you need to stay." Clara climbed down, her legs stiff and aching from the long ride, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She lifted Ellie and Sam from the wagon, Ellie leaning heavily into her, her small body warm with exhaustion while Sam clung to her hand. His fingers trembling, his eyes darting to Eli. Eli led Sage to the barn, his steps deliberate, his duster coat swaying slightly. He returned with a tin plate piled with cornbread and a pot of bean stew, steam rising in the cooling air, the scent of warmth cutting through the dust. "Eat," he said, setting it on the porch steps, his voice gentle but firm. Clara hesitated, her wariness lingering, then knelt, breaking the cornbread for the children, their small hands grabbing eagerly, their faces softening for the first time in days. She took a bite herself, the warmth spreading through her, easing the knot in her chest, though her eyes never left Eli Dot as dusk settled over the valley. Stars piercing the deep indigo sky, Clara sat on the porch, the children asleep inside, tucked into a spare room under a heavy quilt. Eli leaned against a post, his silhouette framed by the soft lantern glow spilling from the house, his face still shadowed by his hat. "They're not yours," he said, his voice soft, not a question but an opening, probing gently. "Clara's." Fingers tightened on her shawl, the fabric rough against her skin. "Their mother died near Lander. Fever took her. I promised I'd keep them safe." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if the words might break her. "My husband was a gambler. Left me with debts, a name no one trusts, and a past I can't outrun. I've been moving ever since, trying to start clean." Eli's gaze shifted to the hills, his silence a quiet space she could fill or leave empty, his presence steady, unjudging. "You're not moving now," he said finally, his words heavy with a certainty that stirred something deep within her, like a spark catching dry tinder. Clara met his eyes, her heart caught between the fear of trusting again and a fragile hope she hadn't felt in years. Could this ranch, this stranger's quiet kindness, be the beginning of a home, or just another fleeting shelter before her past came calling? The Wyoming dawn broke over the valley, late spring of 1879, its soft golden light spilling across the prairie, painting the sagebrush and red dirt in hues of hope and quiet promise. Cottonwoods rustled by the creek, their leaves whispering secrets to the morning breeze, and one question lingered like mist over the rugged land. What does it take for a woman, bound by a vow to others, to find a corner of the world where her own heart can finally breathe? Clara Hensley stood on the porch of Eli Warren's ranch, her hands still raw from days gripping the wagon reins, her faded calico dress gray-blue and patched at the hem catching the morning light, its faint stains of blood now scrubbed clean. Inside the log house, Ellie and Sam slept under a heavy quilt, their small bodies curled close, their breath steady in a peace they hadn't known since their mother's death. The vow Clara made to that dying woman to keep her children safe pressed against her chest, heavy but no longer a chain. Sage, the chestnut moray, grazed in the corral, her limp easing after a night's rest, her coat glinting under the sun. Clara clutched a tin mug of coffee Eli had left by the door, its warmth seeping into her palms, grounding her in this unfamiliar stillness. Her brown shawl hung loosely over her shoulders, its frayed edges swaying in the breeze, and she stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on gravel, her eyes tracing the hills where the dawn painted hope in gold. The ranch hummed with quiet life, roosters crowed. A windmill creaked beside the barn, and smoke curled from the tin chimney, carrying the scent of burning pine. Clara walked to the edge of the yard, her gaze lingering on the cottonwoods by the creek, their branches swaying like a lullaby. She'd spent years running, her name tarnished by a gambler husband's debts, her trust eroded by a world that judged her before it listened. This ranch, with its sturdy log house and whispering creek, felt like a pause of breath she hadn't dared to take since the trails turned her heart to stone. But doubt lingered, whispering that safety was a fleeting gift, that her past would find her even here. Eli emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders dusted with hay, his dappled gray horse tied nearby, its mane catching the light. His hat was low, shadowing his face, but his movements were deliberate, steady, like a man who knew the land's rhythm by heart. He carried a pitchfork, leaning it against a fence post, and caught Clara's gaze across the yard. "You're up early," he said, his voice low and rough, like wind over stone, carrying a warmth that stirred something deep within her. Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the mug, the coffee steam rising in the cool air. "Couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Too quiet, maybe. I'm not used to it." He gave a small nod as if he understood the weight of silence better than most, and gestured toward the fence. "Could use a hand mending this," he said, his tone gentle but not pressing. Clara set the mug down, her hands grateful for work. And they labored side by side, Clara hammering nails into sagging boards while Eli tightened wire. Ellie and Sam woke, their laughter spilling into the yard as they chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Their faces brighter, their small voices carrying a joy Clara hadn't heard in days. She paused, watching them, her heart catching at their fleeting happiness, a pang of guilt mixing with hope. Eli handed her a hammer. his fingers brushing hers briefly, and she felt a spark, faint, unfamiliar, like a seed stirring in dry soil. "They're different already," he said, his eyes on the children, his voice soft but sure. "Kids need a place to breathe." Clara's throat tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "They haven't had that in a long time." "Neither have I." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his shadowed face for a lie, but found only quiet resolve. Like a man who'd carried his own losses and learned to stand through them. At midday, Eli brought out a sack of dried apples, sharing them with Ellie and Sam, who sat on the porch steps, their hands sticky, their laughter light. Clara joined them, her shawl slipping as she sat, the sun warm on her face, softening the edges of her weariness. Eli leaned against the railing, his hat tilted back, revealing a faint scar along his jaw, a mark of battles she didn't yet know. "You said you've been running?" he said, his voice gentle, probing like a question he didn't expect her to answer. Clara's fingers stilled on an apple slice, her gaze dropping to the porch. "My husband gambled away our life," she sighed, her voice low, raw. "Left me with debts, a name folks curse, and a past I can't outrun. I've been moving ever since, trying to start clean." Eli's eyes held hers, steady, unjudging, like a man who'd seen his own share of ghosts. "You stopped here," he said, his words heavy with quiet certainty, like a promise to the land itself. Clara's heart stirred, caught between the fear of trusting again and a fragile hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. As the afternoon sun dipped, casting long shadows across the valley, a low rumble echoed from the hills, not thunder, but the steady thud of hooves, growing closer, like a storm she couldn't outrun. Was it just the wind carrying echoes, or had Clara's past found her in this quiet haven? The Wyoming dusk draped the valley in a velvet cloak, late spring of 1879, the sky deepening to indigo, stars flickering like scattered embers over the prairie. The creek's soft murmur wove through the rustle of cottonwoods, their branches swaying in the cooling breeze, and one question hung heavy in the still air. What happens when the past a woman fled rides into the fragile haven she's dared to call home? Clara Hensley stood on the porch of Eli Warren's ranch, her faded calico dress gray-blue, patched at the hem swaying gently, its faint stains of blood long scrubbed away. Her brown shawl hung loosely over her shoulders, its frayed edges catching the faint glow of a lantern spilling from the log house behind her. Inside, Ellie and Sam slept under a quilt, their small faces peaceful, a stark contrast to the restless fear that stirred in Clara's chest. The vow she'd made to their dying mother, to keep them safe, pulsed like a heartbeat, steady but shadowed by doubt. Sage, the chestnut murray, grazed in the corral, her limp nearly gone, her coat shimmering under the starlight. Clara clutched a tin mug, its coffee cold, her fingers tracing its dented edge as her eyes scanned the hills where the last light had vanished. She'd spent years running from a gambler husband's debts, her name tarnished by whispers and judgment, her trust eroded by a world that turned its back. This ranch, with its sturdy barn and whispering creek, felt like a fragile dream, but the distant rumble of hooves from the hills, faint at first, then growing louder, stirred a fear she couldn't silence. The ranch was hushed, its rhythm slowed to a whisper, roosters silent, the windmill's creak faint, the chimney smoke curling thin into the night. Clara stepped into the yard, her boots crunching on gravel, her breath catching as the hoofbeats grew steady, relentless, like a storm rolling in. She'd learned to dread the sound of riders in the dark, memories of her husband's creditors haunting her like specters on the trail. Eli emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders dusted with hay, his dappled gray horse tied nearby, its ears twitching at the sound. His hat was low, shadowing his face, but his movements were calm, deliberate, like a man who'd faced trouble before and knew its weight. He paused, his eyes meeting Clara's, steady and unyielding, a quiet strength that anchored her. "Stay." "By the porch," he said, his voice low, like gravel smoothed by wind, carrying a resolve that made her heart steady. If only for a moment, before Clara could respond. 3 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the starry sky, their coats flapping in the wind. The leader, a wiry man with a face carved by years of cruelty, reined in his horse, his eyes glinting like steel in the moonlight. Clara's blood froze. She knew him. Amos Reed, her husband's gambling partner, a man who'd hunted her since. Cheyenne, claiming she owed debts she never signed, his greed as sharp as the knife at his belt. "Clara Hensley," he drawled, his voice slicing through the night, cold and mocking. "Thought you could slip away?" His tattered coat hung open, his hand resting on a revolver, his two companions silent but watchful, their horses pawing. The dirt, their shadows looming long. Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady, cutting through the chill. "I owe you nothing, Amos," she said, her words fierce, born of years dodging his shadow. "My husband's sins died with him." Inside, Ellie and Sam stirred, their small voices calling from the window, Ellie's cry piercing the night. Like a blade. Clara's heart clenched, her vow to protect them burning brighter than her fear, urging her to stand taller. Amos laughed, a sound like shattering glass, and dismounted, his boots heavy in the dust, his shadow creeping closer. "You'll pay, one way or another," he said, his eyes narrowing, his hand twitching toward his gun. "Those kids won't save you." Clara's breath hitched, her fingers clenching her shawl, but before she could speak, Eli stepped between them, his stance calm but unyielding, his hand resting near his revolver at his hip. His hat tilted back slightly, revealing the faint scar along his jaw, glinting in the lantern light. "She said she's done with you," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight that made the air crackle with tension. Amos's smirk faltered, his hand hovering over his gun, but Eli's gaze held him, steady as stone, like a man who'd faced worse than threats and walked away. "This ain't your fight, rancher," Amos spat, his voice sharp with venom. Eli didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Amos's. "It is now," he said, his words a quiet promise. His presence a shield Clara hadn't expected but felt deep in her bones. The ranch stood frozen, the creek's murmur the only sound, the cottonwoods swaying like silent witnesses under the starlight. Clara's heart pounded, her eyes darting between Eli and Amos, her hands shaking as she glanced back at the house, where Ellie's small frame stood in the doorway, Sam beside her, clutching her hand. The lantern light flickered, casting shadows that danced like threats across the walls. Clara stepped toward the children, her voice soft but firm, urging them back inside. But Amos's men shifted, their rifles glinting, their eyes cold. Eli's hand stayed on Amos, his posture unwavering, a silent vow in the set of his shoulders. Clara's chest tightened, her fear clashing with a fierce spark of defiance. A fire kindled by the children's trust and Eli's quiet strength. She faced Amos, her voice rising, clear and unyielding. "I'm not your debtor," she said, her words slicing through the night. "Leave this house or you'll regret riding here." Amos's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his revolver. But Eli's steady presence held him in check, like a storm paused before breaking. The riders hesitated, their horses snorting, restless. "This ain't over," Amos growled, his voice low and bitter, mounting his horse with a jerk of the reins. His men followed, their hooves thundering into the darkness, leaving a cloud of dust that shimmered in the starlight. Fading into the hills. Clara sank onto the porch steps, her hands trembling, the mug rolling into the dirt, its clink echoing in the silence. Eli knelt beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder, his voice soft but sure. "You all right?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, tears burning her eyes as she looked at him, his scar softened by the lantern's glow. Her heart wavered between fear and a fierce growing hope, kindled by a man who'd stood for her without asking why. Had Amos's retreat bought her time to build a life here, or was her past only biding its time to strike again? The Wyoming morning bloomed over the valley, early summer of 1879, the sun casting a golden glow across the prairie, where sagebrush swayed and the creek sparkled like a promise kept. Cottonwoods stood sentinel, their leaves whispering in the warm breeze, and one question lingered like a melody over the land. Can a woman, haunted by her past, dare to build a future when every step feels like a leap into the unknown? Clara Hensley stood by the corral of Eli Warren's ranch, Her faded calico dress gray-blue, patched at the hem brushing her boots. Her brown shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, its frayed edges soft in the sunlight. Inside the log house, Ellie and Sam played, their laughter spilling through the open door, a sound that warmed Clara's heart but didn't erase the shadow of Amos Reed's threat. The vow she'd made to their dying mother, to keep them safe, burned steady, but the memory of Amos's cold eyes and the thud of his rider's hooves lingered like a storm on the horizon. Sage, the chestnut mare, nickered softly, her limp gone, her coat gleaming after days of rest. Clara's hands, no longer raw, held a basket of eggs she'd gathered from the hen coop, a small act of purpose that grounded her in this fragile haven. The ranch hummed with life, roosters crowed. The windmill spun lazily, and smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of baking bread. Clara walked to the garden, a patch of earth Eli had tilled, where she'd planted carrots and beans, their green shoots peeking through the soil. She'd spent years running, her name tarnished by a gambler husband's debts, her trust shattered by a world that judged her without hearing her story. This ranch, with its sturdy barn and cottonwood grove, felt like a dream she was afraid to claim, but each day here mending fences, feeding the children, kindled a hope she hadn't known. She could feel Eli emerge from the barn, his broad shoulders dusted with hay, his dappled gray horse grazing nearby. His hat was tilted back, revealing the faint scar along his jaw, softened by the morning light. He carried a sack of grain, his steps steady, and paused when he saw Clara, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "You're good with the garden," he said, his voice low, like gravel warmed by the sun, carrying a warmth that stirred her. Clara set the basket down, her fingers brushing the shawl, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's been a while since I had earth to tend," she said softly. "Feels like starting over." They worked together that morning, Clara tying beanstalks to stakes while Eli repaired a gate, their silence comfortable, broken only by the children's laughter as Ellie and Sam chased a grasshopper through the yard. At noon, Eli brought out a jug of water and a plate of biscuits, setting them on a blanket under a cottonwood. The children ran to join them, their faces bright, their small hands grabbing the food eagerly. Clara sat beside them, her shawl slipping, the sun warm on her face. Eli leaned against the tree, his hat low, watching the kids with a faint smile. "They're home here," he said, his voice soft but sure. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes on Ellie's braid, Sam's sticky fingers. "They deserve it," she whispered. "I'm not sure I do." Eli's gaze shifted to her, steady, searching like a man who'd seen loss and learned its shape. "You're not your husband's debts," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "You're more than what you've run from." Clara's fingers stilled on a biscuit, her heart pounding. She met his eyes, her voice barely audible. "I was a seamstress once, before he ruined everything. I used to dream of a shop, a place of my own. Now I don't know what I'm allowed to want." Eli set the jug down, his hand resting near hers, not touching but close enough to feel. "You're allowed to want a life, Clara," he said, his voice low, fierce with quiet conviction. "Start here." She looked at him, her heart stirring with a hope she'd thought was buried, like a spark catching dry tinder. That afternoon, Eli showed her a small shed behind the barn, its shelves lined with dusty fabric and thread relics of his mother's sewing. "It's yours if you want it," he said, his eyes steady, offering not just tools but a piece of the future. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the valley, Clara stood in the shed, her fingers tracing a spool of thread, her heart caught between fear and possibility. Ellie and Sam ran to her, their small arms wrapping around her waist, their laughter bright. Eli watched from the barn, his silhouette framed by the fading light, his presence a quiet anchor. But as twilight deepened, a faint glint caught Clara's eye, a rider watching from the ridge, too far to see his face, but close enough to send a chill down her spine. Was it Amos Reed, biding his time, or was her fear painting shadows where none existed? The Wyoming summer unfurled over the valley, early August 1879, the prairie blooming with wildflowers under a sky so wide it seemed to hold every dream ever whispered. The creek sang softly, cottonwood swaying in the warm breeze, and one question: glowed like sunlight on the hills. Can a woman, scarred by her past, weave a new life from the threads of kindness and courage and call it home? Clara Hensley stood in the doorway of Eli Warren's ranch house, her calico dress gray-blue, neatly patched, brushing her boots, her brown shawl folded on a chair, no longer needed in the summer's warmth. Inside, Ellie and Sam laughed over. A wooden puzzle, their faces bright, their small voices a melody that softened the edges of Clara's heart. The vow she'd made to their dying mother, to keep them safe, had rooted her here in this valley where sagebrush met hope. Sage. The chestnut Murray grazed contentedly in the corral, her strength restored, her coat gleaming under the sun. Clara's hands, once raw from the trail, now held a needle and thread, stitching a small dress for Ellie from fabric found in Eli's shed. Her past a gambler husband's debts, a name tarnished by lies, still lingered, but the shadow of Amos Reed's threat felt distant, like a storm that had passed. Yet Clara knew better than to trust the quiet. The ranch pulsed with life, roosters crowed. The windmill spun steadily, and the garden flourished with carrots and beans tended by Clara's careful hands. She'd taken to sewing again, her fingers rediscovering the rhythm of a trade she'd loved before her world unraveled. The shed behind the barn had become her sanctuary, its shelves lined with thread and cloth, a space where she could dream. Again, she'd started teaching Ellie and Sam letters, their small hands tracing chalk on slates, their laughter filling the house. Each day here felt like a stitch in a new life, but the glint of a rider on the ridge days ago still haunted her, a reminder that her past was never far. Eli emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders dusted with hay, his dappled gray horse tied nearby, its ears flicking in the breeze. His hat was tilted back, revealing the scar along his jaw, softened by the sunlight, his eyes steady with a warmth that made Clara's heart skip. He carried a bundle of wood, setting it by the porch, and paused when he saw her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're making that shed your own," he said, his voice low, like gravel warmed by the sun. Clara's fingers stilled on the needle, her eyes meeting his. "It's been a long time since I had a place to call mine," she said softly, her voice carrying a hope she was only beginning to trust. They worked together that afternoon, Clara, mending a torn saddle blanket while Eli repaired a fence, their silence comfortable, woven with the children's laughter as Ellie and Sam chased fireflies in the yard. At dusk, Eli brought out a tin box from the house, its lid rusted but intact. "My sister's," he said, opening it to reveal letters and a small locket etched with a flower. "She taught school before she passed. Thought you might use these for the kids." Clara's throat tightened as she took the locket, her fingers tracing its edges. "You don't talk about her," she said, her voice soft. Eli's gaze drifted to the hills. "Lost her to fever, like you lost their mother? I couldn't save her, but I can help you save them." Clara's heart stirred, her eyes meeting his, seeing the weight he carried, the losses that mirrored her own. "You've done more than help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given us a chance." Eli's hand rested near hers, not touching but close, his presence a quiet anchor. "You gave yourself that chance, Clara?" he said, his words heavy with conviction. "You just needed a place to stand?" As night fell, stars blazing over the valley, Clara and Eli sat on the porch, the children asleep inside. She told them of her dreams, a shop of her own, shelves lined with books, a garden that bloomed beyond survival. He listened, his silence. "A space where her hopes could grow?" "We'll build it," he said, his voice soft but certain, like a vow to the land itself. Clara's eyes glistened, her heart caught between fear and a fierce blooming hope. They married the next week under the cottonwoods, Clara in a dress she'd sewn, Ellie and Sam scattering wildflowers, the creek their witness. The 1870s West was a land of second chances, where resilience forged new roots in hard soil. If Clara and Eli's story moved you, like and subscribe for more Frontier Tales. As they stood hand in hand, the valley glowing under the stars, a distant hoofbeat echoed from the hills, faint but growing closer like a shadow refusing to fade. Had Amos Reed returned to claim his debt, or was the future Clara had built strong enough to withstand the storm?